They looked at my faded jeans and beat-up sneakers and decided I was just another broke 20-something wasting their time. The property manager actually rolled her eyes when I asked about the lease requirements. But when my wallet slipped from my back pocket and my military ID fell out, everything changed in ways I never expected. The same woman who'd been treating me like a charity case suddenly straightened up, and when the landlord himself appeared and saw that ID, the words that came out of his mouth shocked everyone in the room. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning I decided to apartment hunt in downtown Portland felt like any other Saturday. I'd driven in from the temporary housing unit outside the city, wearing my most comfortable clothes because I planned to spend the day walking through neighborhoods and climbing stairs. What I didn't expect was how those comfortable clothes would become a weapon used against me before I even spoke to anyone about square footage or security deposits. I'd been out of active duty for exactly 3 weeks. 22 years of service, most of it overseas, and now I was trying to figure out what civilian life looked like. The transition counselors had warned me it would be different, but nobody really prepares you for how different everything feels when you're not wearing a uniform anymore. When you're not Major Sarah Rodriguez anymore, when you're just another person in jeans trying to find a place to call home. The apartment complex on Northwest Burnside looked perfect from the street. Red brick building, well-maintained grounds, close enough to the max line that I could get anywhere in the city without dealing with downtown parking. The kind of place that looked stable, permanent. The opposite of the temporary quarters and deployment housing I'd called home for over 2 decades. I pushed through the glass doors of the leasing office, and the first thing I noticed was how quiet it got. Not peaceful quiet, but the kind of silence that happens when people are making quick judgments about whether you belong somewhere. The waiting area had leather furniture that actually matched, and magazines that weren't 6 months old. Everything was designed to say professional, upscale, serious applicants only. Behind the reception desk sat a woman in her early 30s with perfectly styled blonde hair and a navy blazer that probably cost more than my monthly car payment. Her name tag read Jennifer Leasing Specialist in gold lettering. She was on the phone when I walked in, but I caught her glancing at me twice while she finished her conversation. Her eyes traveled from my scuffed Converse sneakers up to my faded Levi's, lingering on the small hole near my left knee that I'd been meaning to repair for months. When she finally hung up, she didn't immediately acknowledge me. Instead, she shuffled through some papers on her desk, typed something into her computer, and adjusted a picture frame. All the busy work people do when they're hoping someone will just go away on their own. "Can I help you?" she finally asked, her tone suggesting that helping me was the last thing she wanted to do on a Saturday morning. "I'm interested in seeing some available units," I said, trying to match her professional tone. "I called yesterday and spoke to someone about setting up appointments." Jennifer's eyebrows rose slightly, like I'd just claimed to be the Queen of England. "Did you speak to someone about our income requirements, credit score minimums, application fees?" The way she said it made it clear she assumed I couldn't meet any of those requirements. I'd been expecting questions about my finances, but I hadn't been expecting the attitude that came with them. "I understand you have requirements," I said, keeping my voice level. "I'd like to know what they are so I can see if we're a good fit." She pulled out a glossy brochure and slid it across the counter like she was doing me a huge favor. Our 1-bedroom units start at $2,800 a month. 2-bedroom units start at $3,400. We require first month's rent, last month's rent, and a security deposit equal to 1 month's rent at signing. Credit score minimum is 720, and your monthly income needs to be at least 3 times the rent amount. She rattled off the numbers like she was reading a grocery list, never making eye contact, clearly expecting me to thank her for her time and leave. When I didn't immediately turn around and walk out, she looked genuinely surprised. "And you have recent pay stubs showing that income level?" she asked, her voice dripping with skepticism. This was where things started to get interesting. I did have recent pay stubs, but they were from the Army. Military pay stubs don't look like civilian pay stubs, and they definitely don't look like what most people expect when they're trying to figure out if someone can afford a nice apartment in Northwest Portland. "I have documentation of my income," I said carefully. "I've been employed steadily for the past 22 years. Jennifer actually laughed. Not a polite chuckle, but a genuine laugh that she didn't bother to hide. "Honey, you look like you're maybe 25. You've been employed for 22 years? What did you start working when you were 3? The condescension in her voice was so thick I could practically taste it. I'd been talked down to before, plenty of times, but usually by people who at least had the excuse of outranking me. This was different. This was someone deciding who I was and what I was worth based on nothing but assumptions. "I'm 39, I said, still keeping my voice steady. "And yes, I've been employed for 22 years. She looked me up and down again, more obviously this time, like she was trying to spot the lie. "In what field?" "Government service." It wasn't technically a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. I'd learned over the years that saying military right away often led to a different kind of assumptions, not all of them positive. Better to start neutral and see where the conversation went. "Government service," she repeated, her tone making it clear she thought I meant something like filing papers at the DMV. "And you make enough to afford our rent prices?" "I believe so, yes." She sighed, the kind of dramatic exhale people use when they think they're being incredibly patient with someone who doesn't deserve it. "Look, I don't want to waste either of our time here. These are luxury apartments. The other tenants are professionals, doctors, lawyers, executives. People with serious careers and stable incomes. If you're looking for something more in your price range, there are some complexes further out that might be more suitable." The dismissal was so smooth, so practiced, that I realized she'd given this speech before, probably many times. She'd perfected the art of getting rid of people she didn't think belonged without technically violating any fair housing laws. But I wasn't ready to be dismissed. "Not yet." "I'd still like to see what you have available," I said, "if that's possible." Jennifer's perfectly painted smile faltered for just a moment. She wasn't used to people pushing back after her more suitable speech. "I suppose I could show you one unit," she said, her tone suggesting she was making an enormous sacrifice. "But I want to be clear about our requirements up front, so there are no misunderstandings later." She pulled out a clipboard with an application attached and set it down in front of me harder than necessary. "Pre-qualification form," she explained. "Current employer, supervisor contact information, monthly income, current address, references. You'll need to fill this out completely before I can show you anything." I picked up the pen and started filling out the form, aware that she was watching every word I wrote. When I got to the employer section, I paused for just a moment before writing U.S. Army in neat block letters. Jennifer craned her neck to see what I was writing, and when she saw those two words, her expression shifted from condescension to confusion. "Army?" she said, like I'd written something in a foreign language. "Yes." "Like the actual army? Military army?" "That's generally what people mean when they say U.S. Army, yes." For the first time since I'd walked in, Jennifer looked uncertain. The military clearly wasn't something she'd encountered much in her professional life, and she wasn't sure how to process it. "So you're like enlisted?" she asked, the word enlisted coming out like she wasn't entirely sure what it meant. "I'm an officer." "Oh, what kind of officer?" I hesitated. In civilian conversations, military ranks often didn't mean much to people. A major might sound important, or it might sound like middle management, depending on who you were talking to. But something about Jennifer's attitude made me want to see how she'd react. "I'm a major." The confusion on her face deepened. "Major what?" "Just major. That's the rank." She clearly had no idea what that meant in terms of responsibility or pay grade, but she seemed to sense that it was probably more significant than whatever she'd been assuming about my background. "And you're stationed here? In Portland?" "I'm transitioning to civilian life. Retirement." "Retirement?" Her voice went up half an octave. "But you said you're 39. Military retirement works differently than civilian retirement." She stared at me for a long moment, clearly trying to reconcile the person standing in front of her with this new information. The cocky dismissiveness was gone, replaced by uncertainty and what might have been the beginning of embarrassment. "I need to... Let me get my manager," she said, disappearing into a back office without waiting for my response. I could hear muffled conversation from the back room, punctuated by what sounded like someone saying, "She says she's a major," in a tone that suggested disbelief. After about 5 minutes, Jennifer returned with a man in his 40s wearing a suit that looked expensive but not quite expensive enough for someone trying too hard to look successful. I'm Brad Morrison, property manager, he said, extending his hand. His handshake was firm but brief, the kind of professional greeting that kept distance while appearing friendly. Jennifer tells me you're interested in our available units. That's right. And you're military? I am. Brad looked at Jennifer, then back at me, clearly trying to figure out how to handle this situation. Military tenants probably weren't common in their demographic, and they seemed to be improvising their approach. Well, we certainly appreciate your service, Brad said, his tone hitting that particular note of generic gratitude that civilians often used when they weren't sure what else to say. Jennifer mentioned you're looking at retirement? I've completed my active duty commitment. I'm transitioning to civilian employment. I see. And do you have a job lined up here in Portland? It was a fair question, but the way he asked it suggested he was still skeptical about my ability to pay their rent, like military retirement was somehow less reliable than a civilian job. I'm exploring several opportunities, I said, which was true. My military pension will provide a significant portion of my income regardless of what civilian employment I choose. Brad's eyebrows went up slightly. Military pensions were apparently another concept he wasn't familiar with. How significant? Jennifer asked, then immediately looked embarrassed that she'd been so direct. I did some quick math in my head. My military pension, combined with my VA disability rating and the consulting work I was already being offered, would put me comfortably above their income requirements. Well above. Enough to meet your income requirements, I said simply. They exchanged another look, and I could see them trying to figure out whether to believe me. In their world, people who could afford luxury apartments probably didn't show up in faded jeans and sneakers. They were having trouble adjusting their assumptions. Well, Brad said finally, why don't we take a look at what we have available? Jennifer grabbed a set of keys from behind the counter, and we headed toward the preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So, if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Elevator. The awkwardness was thick enough to cut with a knife. They'd started this interaction with complete confidence in their assessment of who I was and what I could afford, and now they were floundering. The elevator ride to the 4th floor was silent except for the mechanical hum of the building's ventilation system. Jennifer kept glancing at me like she was trying to solve a puzzle, while Brad stared at the floor numbers like they held the secrets of the universe. This is our premium one-bedroom, Jennifer said as she unlocked apartment 4C. 900 square feet, updated kitchen, hardwood floors throughout, in-unit washer and dryer. She was back in professional mode, but the confidence was forced now. She opened the door and gestured for me to enter first, which was a marked change from her earlier attitude. The apartment was nice. Clean, modern, with big windows that let in plenty of natural light. The kind of place I could see myself actually living in after years of military housing that prioritized function over comfort. What's the monthly rent on this one? I asked, running my hand along the granite countertop in the kitchen. $28.50, Brad answered. Plus utilities, which typically run about $150 to $200 depending on usage. I nodded, doing the math. With my pension and disability, I could easily afford it. Even if I didn't find civilian work right away, the rent would be less than 30% of my income. And the lease terms? Standard 12-month lease, Jennifer said. First month, last month, and security deposit due at signing. Move-in would be available immediately upon approval. She was trying to sound professional, but I could hear the uncertainty in her voice. They still weren't sure whether to take me seriously as a prospective tenant. The approval process, I said. What does that involve? Brad cleared his throat. Credit check, income verification, references. Standard procedure. We typically get back to applicants within 48 to 72 hours. And the income verification. What documentation do you need? Usually 3 months of pay stubs, bank statements, employment verification letter from your current employer. I could see where this was heading. My pay stubs were military pay stubs, my bank statements would show direct deposits from the Department of Defense, and my employment verification would come from the Army. None of it would look like what they were used to seeing. My documentation might look different from what you typically see, I said. Military pay and benefits are structured differently than civilian employment. Different how? Jennifer asked. I pulled out my phone and opened my banking app, turning the screen so they could see my account balance. It wasn't something I would normally do, but their skepticism was starting to irritate me. Their eyes widened simultaneously. The number on the screen was more than enough to cover several months of rent, and it was clearly just my checking account. "This is from your military pay?" Brad asked, his tone noticeably more respectful than it had been 5 minutes earlier. "Accumulated pay and allowances, yes. Plus, my retirement got processed earlier than expected." Jennifer was staring at my phone screen like it was showing her the winning lottery numbers. I had no idea military pay was so substantial, I suggested. "I was going to say competitive," she said, but her face was red. Brad was looking at me with a completely different expression now. The dismissive property manager was gone, replaced by someone who was starting to realize he might have misjudged a situation. "Major Rodriguez," he said, using my rank for the first time. "I think we may have gotten off on the wrong foot here." It was an apology without actually being an apology. The kind of diplomatic non-apology that people used when they realized they'd made a mistake but didn't want to admit it directly. "I'm just looking for a good place to call home," I said. "This seems like it might work." "It would work perfectly," Jennifer said quickly. "This is exactly the kind of tenant we're looking for. Stable income, long employment history, responsible." It was amazing how quickly responsible I'd become once they saw my bank balance. We finished touring the apartment, and they walked me back to the leasing office with a completely different energy than when we'd left. Jennifer was practically bouncing with enthusiasm, pointing out amenities she hadn't bothered to mention earlier. "The fitness center is open 24 hours, she said as we passed it. "And we have a business center with computers and printers if you ever need to work from home." "The rooftop deck has city views," Brad added. "Great for entertaining." They were selling me on the place now, trying to make sure I didn't walk away. It was a complete reversal from 45 minutes earlier when they'd been trying to get rid of me as quickly as possible. Back in the leasing office, Jennifer spread the application paperwork across her desk with the efficiency of someone who suddenly had a motivated buyer. "If you want to move forward, I can start the application process right now," she said. "Given your qualifications, I don't anticipate any issues with approval." My qualifications hadn't changed since I'd walked in. The only thing that had changed was their perception of what those qualifications were worth. I was reaching for my wallet to get my ID for the application when it happened. The wallet was old, worn leather that had been through more deployments than I cared to count, and the back pocket was getting loose. As I pulled it out, it slipped from my fingers and hit the floor, spilling its contents across the carpet. Credit cards, cash, receipts, and my military ID all scattered at my feet. I bent down to gather everything up, but Jennifer was faster. She picked up my military ID and handed it to me, but not before getting a good look at it. "Major Sarah Rodriguez," she read aloud. "U.S. Army." But that wasn't what made her stop talking. What made her stop talking was the photo on the ID, which showed me in my dress uniform, and more importantly, the small details she could see around the edges of the card. Military IDs are packed with information if you know how to read them. Rank, years of service, security clearance levels, specialized training certifications. Jennifer didn't know how to read most of it, but she could see that there was a lot more information there than on a regular driver's license. Brad leaned over to look at the ID, and his expression changed too. "Is that from this year?" "A few months ago," I said, taking the ID back. "They issue new ones periodically." "You're really a major," Jennifer said, like she was just now believing it. "I really am." Brad was quiet for a moment, studying me with the kind of attention people pay when they're trying to figure out how they missed something important. "What did you do in the Army?" he asked. "If you don't mind me asking." It was a fair question, and now that they'd seen my ID, there wasn't much point in being vague. "Military intelligence," I said. "Analysis, strategic planning, overseas operations coordination." The words landed differently than they might have an hour earlier, when they thought I was some broke kid trying to scam my way into a nice apartment. My background didn't matter. Now that they knew I could afford the rent, suddenly my experience seemed impressive. "Overseas operations," Brad repeated. "Like deployment." "Several deployments. Iraq, Afghanistan, some other places." "Combat?" Jennifer asked, then immediately looked embarrassed. "Sorry, I don't know if that's something you can talk about. Some combat, yes. They were both staring at me now with expressions I'd seen before. Civilians often looked at veterans this way once they understood what military service actually meant, especially overseas service. It was a mixture of respect, curiosity, and something that might have been intimidation. The silence stretched out long enough to become uncomfortable, and I was about to suggest we finish the application process when the front door opened and another man walked in. This one was older, probably in his 60s, with gray hair and the kind of posture that immediately marked him as former military. He moved with the economy of motion that never really goes away, and his eyes automatically swept the room in the way people do when situational awareness has become second nature. "Sorry to interrupt," he said to Brad. "I was in the neighborhood and wanted to check on how that maintenance issue got resolved." "No problem, Mr. Chen," Brad said. "This is Major Rodriguez. She's looking at renting Unit 4C. Mr. Chen's eyes shifted to me, and I saw the moment of recognition. Not recognition of me personally, but recognition of something familiar in how I carried myself. "Major Rodriguez," he said, extending his hand. "Army?" "Yes, sir." His handshake was firm and brief, the way military people shake hands. Professional, respectful, no wasted motion. "How long?" 22 years. His eyebrows went up. "That's a career. What was your MOS?" MOS, military occupational specialty. The question every veteran asked other veterans, and the fact that he asked it told me everything I needed to know about his background. 35F, I said. "Intelligence analyst. You?" "Infantry, then later military police. 26 years total." He looked at Brad and Jennifer, both of whom were following this conversation like it was happening in a foreign language. "You're in good hands with Major Rodriguez. Career officers don't make it 22 years without being squared away." Brad looked confused. "Squared away?" "Reliable," Mr. Chen explained. "Competent. The kind of tenant who pays rent on time and doesn't cause problems." He turned back to me. "Transitioning to civilian life?" "Yes, sir. Still figuring out what that looks like." "It's an adjustment," he said with the knowing nod of someone who'd been through the same process. "But Portland's a good place for it. Lot of opportunities for someone with your background." He shook my hand again. "Welcome to the neighborhood, Major. I think you'll like it here." With that, he headed toward the elevator, leaving behind a leasing office that had gone completely quiet. Jennifer was the first to speak. "He called you Major. That's my rank. But he said it like it meant something." "It does mean something." Brad was looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. 22 years, he said slowly. "You started when you were 17? 18, right out of high school. And you made Major. It's a respectable rank," I said, not wanting to oversell it, but not wanting to undersell it either. Jennifer had pulled out her computer and was typing rapidly. After a moment, she turned the screen toward Brad. "I looked up military ranks," she said quietly. "Major is pretty high up." I couldn't see what she was looking at, but I could guess. Probably some website explaining military hierarchy, maybe showing the insignia, possibly mentioning the responsibilities that came with field-grade officer rank. Brad read whatever she'd found, and his expression shifted again. "It says here that majors typically command hundreds of soldiers." "Depends on the assignment," I said. "Sometimes more, sometimes fewer." "And you did intelligence work." "Among other things." They were both looking at me like they were seeing me for the first time, which, in a way, they were. An hour ago, I'd been some random person in old jeans who probably couldn't afford their rent. Now I was a career military officer with command experience and a security clearance. The truth hadn't changed, only their perception of it had. "Major Rodriguez," Brad said, his tone formal now, almost deferential. "I want to apologize for any misunderstanding earlier. We get a lot of applicants who aren't serious, and sometimes we make assumptions we shouldn't make." It was as close to a real apology as I was likely to get, and I appreciated the honesty. "I understand," I said. "You have to protect your property and your other tenants." "Still," Jennifer said, "we should have been more professional, more respectful." She was right, but arguing about it wouldn't accomplish anything. I just wanted to know if I could rent the apartment. "So," I said, "where do we stand with the application?" Brad and Jennifer looked at each other, and some kind of silent communication passed between them. "Honestly," Brad said, "if you want the apartment, it's yours. I don't need to run a credit check or wait for income verification. Your military service record speaks for itself." "Just like that?" "Just like that." He pulled out a lease agreement from his desk drawer. "When would you like to move in?" The speed of the turnaround was almost dizzying. 2 hours ago, they'd been trying to get rid of me. Now they were offering me the apartment without even running the background checks they'd insisted were mandatory. "I'd like to move in as soon as possible," I said. "This weekend, if that works." "Absolutely," Jennifer said, already pulling out paperwork. "I can have everything ready by tomorrow morning if you can get me the deposit." She was moving with the efficiency of someone who was afraid I might change my mind and walk away. The transformation was so complete that it would have been funny if it wasn't so revealing about how they'd initially seen me. As I filled out the lease paperwork, I couldn't help but think about how the entire interaction had played out. Nothing about me had actually changed during the course of our conversation. I was the same person who'd walked in wearing the same clothes with the same background and the same financial capability. The only thing that had changed was their knowledge of who I really was. But that made me wonder, how many other people had walked into this office and been dismissed based on appearances? How many qualified applicants had been turned away because they didn't look like what Jennifer and Brad expected their tenants to look like? "Is there anything else you need from me?" I asked as I signed the final page of the lease. "Just the deposits," Brad said. "First month, last month, and security deposit. That'll be $85.50 total." I pulled out my phone and opened my banking app. "Can I transfer it directly?" "You can do that right now?" Jennifer asked, sounding impressed. "Military banking is pretty advanced," I said, typing in the routing information they provided. "We need to be able to handle finances from anywhere in the world." The transfer went through immediately, and Brad's phone chimed with a notification from his business account. "That's it," he said, extending his hand. "Welcome to Burnside Commons, Major Rodriguez." The handshake was different this time. Firmer, more respectful, the kind of greeting reserved for people they considered equals. As I gathered up my copies of the paperwork, Jennifer cleared her throat. "Major Rodriguez, can I ask you something?" "Sure." "When you first came in and we were less than welcoming, why didn't you just leave? I mean, most people would have walked out after the way we treated you." It was a good question, and one I'd been asking myself. "I've been turned away from places before," I said. "Sometimes it's worth pushing back against assumptions. Sometimes it's not. Today felt like it was worth it. But you could have just told us right away that you were a major. That would have avoided all the awkwardness." I thought about that for a moment. "I could have," I agreed. "But then I wouldn't have learned anything about how you treat people you think can't afford to be here." The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Jennifer's face flushed red, and Brad looked uncomfortable. "We don't usually," Brad started, then stopped. "That is, we try to treat all prospective tenants with respect." "I'm sure you do," I said, but we all knew that wasn't entirely true. "Will this affect how you feel about living here?" Jennifer asked, and I could hear genuine concern in her voice. "That depends," I said. "Are you going to treat your other tenants the way you initially treated me, or the way you're treating me now?" "The second way," she said quickly. "Definitely the second way. Then I think we'll get along fine." I headed toward the door, my keys to apartment 4C heavy in my pocket. As I reached for the handle, Brad called after me. "Major Rodriguez?" I turned back. "Thank you for your service." It was the same generic phrase he'd used earlier, but this time it sounded different. Less automatic, more genuine. Like he actually understood, at least partially, what that service had meant. "Thank you," I said. Outside, the Portland morning had turned into afternoon. The sun was higher now, warming the sidewalk and casting shorter shadows. I sat in my car for a few minutes, processing what had just happened. In 22 years of military service, I'd dealt with plenty of assumptions and stereotypes. The assumptions people made about female soldiers, about intelligence officers, about career military personnel transitioning to civilian life. But this had been different. This had been about class and economics, and the invisible barriers that exist between people based on nothing more than appearances. The apartment was perfect. The location was ideal, the price was fair, and now that I'd established my credibility, I was confident that living there would be fine. But the interaction had left me thinking about all the ways that first impressions could be wrong, and all the opportunities that got lost when people made decisions based on assumptions. I thought about Mr. Chen, the older veteran who'd vouched for me without knowing anything about me except my rank and years of service. That kind of immediate recognition and respect was something that existed within the military community, a shared understanding of what certain achievements meant. But outside that community, those same achievements were invisible until proven otherwise. My phone buzzed with a text from my sister who'd been helping me coordinate the move to Portland. "How did the apartment hunting go?" I stared at the message for a moment, trying to figure out how to summarize the morning's events. "Got the apartment," I typed back. "Interesting day. Good interesting or bad interesting? Educational interesting." She sent back a question mark emoji, but I didn't elaborate. Some lessons were too complicated to explain in a text message. I started the car and drove back toward my temporary housing, thinking about the boxes I'd need to pack and the utilities I'd need to transfer and all the mundane details of moving. But mostly I thought about the look on Jennifer's face when she'd realized who she'd been talking to, and the way Brad's entire demeanor had changed once he understood my background. Tomorrow I'd start the process of becoming a civilian tenant in a civilian apartment complex, just another resident paying rent and dealing with maintenance requests and neighbor complaints. But today had been a reminder that the transition from military to civilian life involved more than just changing clothes and finding a job. It involved navigating a world where people made assumptions based on incomplete information, where respect had to be earned in different ways, where the achievements that had defined my adult life were invisible until proven otherwise. But it also involved discovering that some assumptions could be changed, that some barriers could be overcome, and that sometimes pushing back against initial judgments led to better outcomes for everyone involved. As I pulled into the parking lot of my temporary housing, I realized I was looking forward to moving into apartment 4C. Not just because it was a nice place and a good location, but because I'd earned the right to be there. Not through my military service, though that had certainly helped in the end, but through my willingness to stand my ground when someone tried to dismiss me based on appearances. The boxes could wait until tomorrow. Today had been about more than finding an apartment. It had been about learning how to be Major Sarah Rodriguez in a world that didn't automatically recognize what that meant, and discovering that sometimes the recognition came eventually, if you were patient enough to wait for it. I walked up the stairs to my temporary apartment, keys jingling in my pocket, already planning how I'd arrange the furniture in my new place. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new assumptions to navigate, new ways to prove myself in a civilian world. But today had been a good start. Moving day arrived with the kind of drizzle that made Portland famous and moving trucks miserable. I'd hired a small crew to help with the heavy lifting, partly because I had more furniture than I'd realized, and partly because 22 years of military service had taught me the value of good logistics. The crew showed up at 7 in the morning, 3 guys in their 20s who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else on a Saturday. The crew chief introduced himself as Danny, a wiry guy with sleeve tattoos and the kind of easy confidence that came from knowing his job well. His 2 helpers, Mike and Carlos, looked newer to the business, still figuring out the most efficient ways to navigate stairs and doorways with oversized furniture. "Nice place," Danny said as we pulled up to Burnside Commons. "Don't get to move people into buildings this fancy very often." "It's a good location," I agreed, watching him assess the loading dock and elevator access with professional eyes. "You been living in Portland long?" Mike asked as we started unloading boxes from the truck. "This is my first permanent place here. I'm transitioning from government work." It was becoming my standard answer for civilian conversations, vague enough to avoid lengthy explanations, but specific enough to satisfy basic curiosity. The elevator ride to the 4th floor was cramped with 3 movers, me and a hand truck loaded with boxes. Carlos was reading the labels I'd written on each box. Organizational habits from years of military moves. "Kitchen, bedroom, office, office, office," he read aloud. "You work from home?" "I will be, at least partially." "What kind of work needs this many office boxes?" Mike asked, genuinely curious. I glanced at the boxes in question. They contained files, reference materials, technical manuals, and computer equipment that most people wouldn't need for a home office. The kind of setup that suggested work requiring security clearances and classified information handling. "Consulting," I said, which was technically true. Several defense contractors had already reached out about contract work. Danny was focused on the logistics of getting my furniture through the hallway, but I caught him glancing at some of the heavier items. Military-issue furniture has a distinctive look, built for durability rather than style, and my desk in particular was clearly government surplus. "This thing weighs a ton," he said, as they maneuvered my steel desk through the apartment door. "What's it made of? Concrete?" "Government furniture," I explained, "built to survive anything." "You work for the government?" Carlos asked, setting down a box marked communications equipment. "I used to." They were getting curious, but in the casual way of people making conversation during physical work. Nothing probing or suspicious. Just the normal human interest in figuring out who they were helping and what their story might be. As we worked through the morning, other residents of the building started appearing in the hallway. Saturday was apparently a social day at Burnside Commons, with people heading out for coffee, returning from early gym sessions, or just checking their mail. Most of them glanced at the moving activity with mild interest before continuing about their business. But one woman lingered. She was probably in her 40s, dressed in expensive workout clothes that looked like they'd never seen actual exercise, carrying a small dog that was wearing a sweater despite the mild weather. Her hair was styled in the kind of precise way that required daily professional maintenance, and she carried herself with the particular confidence of someone who'd never been told no by anyone who mattered. "Excuse me," she said, addressing Danny rather than me, "how much longer is this going to take? The noise is quite disruptive." Danny looked at his watch. "We've been here about 2 hours. Should be done in another hour or so." 2 hours? She made it sound like we'd been disrupting her day since dawn. "This is a luxury building. Surely there are regulations about when moving activities can take place." "Building management approved the time slot," I said, stepping into the conversation. "We checked with the leasing office yesterday." She looked at me like she was noticing me for the first time, and I could see her cataloging my appearance. Jeans again, work boots, hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Everything about me screamed, "Not one of us," to someone who measured worth by designer labels and professional styling. "And you are?" she asked, her tone suggesting she already didn't approve of the answer. "Sarah Rodriguez. I'm moving into 4C. "I see." Her expression suggested she saw quite a lot, none of it good. "And what do you do, Miss Rodriguez?" The formal address was clearly meant to establish hierarchy. She was someone important talking to someone who probably wasn't. "I'm transitioning from government service to private consulting." Government service. She repeated the phrase like it tasted bad. "What kind of government service?" Mike and Carlos had stopped working to listen to this exchange. Danny was still moving boxes, but I could tell he was paying attention. Even in civilian situations, there was something about confrontation that made people stop what they were doing and watch. "Military service," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "Oh." The single syllable carried a world of assumptions. "Well, I hope you understand that this building has certain standards. Quiet hours, common area policies, guest restrictions. We've worked hard to maintain a professional atmosphere." She was giving me the same speech Jennifer had tried to give me at the leasing office, just with different words. The underlying message was identical. You don't belong here, and we need to make sure you understand the rules so you don't embarrass yourself or disturb the people who do belong. "I'm familiar with community standards," I said. "I've lived in group settings for most of my adult life." "Group settings?" She looked confused, like I'd just claimed to have lived on Mars. "Military housing, bases, deployed locations. You learn pretty quickly how to be a good neighbor when you're living in close quarters with hundreds of other people." Danny grinned at that, and I caught Mike nodding approvingly. They understood the concept of community living, even if it wasn't the same kind of community this woman was used to. "Yes, well," she said, clearly flustered that her lecture hadn't gone as planned. "I'm sure military housing is quite different from luxury residential living." "In some ways," I agreed. "Military housing tends to have higher standards for personal conduct and community responsibility." The silence that followed was the kind that happens when someone realizes they've walked into a conversation they weren't prepared for. She'd started this interaction from a position of assumed superiority, and somehow the dynamic had shifted without her realizing how. "I'm Patricia Whitmore," she said finally, like her name was supposed to mean something. "Unit 4A. I serve on the Residence Council." "Nice to meet you, Patricia." The casual use of her first name clearly bothered her. She was used to being Mrs. Whitmore or Ms. Whitmore, titles that established appropriate distance and respect. "Mrs. Whitmore," she corrected, "and I hope we can count on you to be mindful of building policies as you settle in." "Absolutely. I've spent my career following policies and procedures. It's pretty much second nature at this point." She looked like she wanted to say more, but Danny chose that moment to wheel my file cabinet past us, and the conversation got interrupted by logistics. By the time he'd maneuvered it through the door, Mrs. Whitmore had apparently decided she'd made her point and disappeared back into her apartment with her overdressed dog. "That was fun," Carlos said once she was gone. "She seems friendly," Mike added sarcastically. "Every building has one," Danny said philosophically. "Someone who thinks they own the place just because they've been there the longest." We finished the move without further incident, and by early afternoon my belongings were distributed throughout apartment 4C in roughly the right rooms. The place looked like every military move I'd ever made, boxes everywhere, furniture in functional but not final positions, the controlled chaos of a life in transition. After the movers left, I spent the rest of the day unpacking the essentials. Kitchen supplies first, because coffee and basic meals were non-negotiable. Bedroom next, because good sleep was critical for everything else. Office setup could wait until tomorrow, when I had more energy for dealing with computer equipment and secure communications setup. As evening approached, I decided to take a walk around the neighborhood to get oriented. Portland was still new enough to me that I wanted to learn the area beyond just the route from my apartment to the grocery store. The drizzle had stopped, leaving the streets clean and shining under the streetlights that were just starting to flicker on. Burnside Commons was in a good location, close enough to downtown to be convenient, but far enough out to avoid the worst of the urban noise and congestion. The kind of neighborhood that felt safe for solo evening walks, something I'd learned not to take for granted in all locations. I was walking back toward the building when I heard voices from the courtyard area. The landscaping included a small seating area with benches and tables, apparently designed for residents who wanted to socialize outdoors. 3 people were sitting around one of the tables, wine glasses catching the light from the building's exterior illumination. One of the voices belonged to Mrs. Whitmore. The other 2 were unfamiliar, but from their tone and cadence, I guess they were cut from similar cloth. Established residents discussing building business and neighborhood concerns. "I'm just saying, we need to be mindful of the demographic shift," Mrs. Whitmore was saying as I approached. "This building has always attracted a certain type of professional resident. We don't want to lose that." "What kind of demographic shift?" asked a male voice. "Military people. Government workers. You know the type. Transient, rough around the edges, not really invested in community standards." I stopped walking. I was close enough to hear clearly, but far enough away that they probably couldn't see me in the shadows between streetlights. "The new woman in 4C," Mrs. Whitmore continued. "Former military, moving in with secondhand government furniture and a crew of movers who look like they'd rather be working construction. It's exactly the kind of element that can change a building's character." "Did you talk to her?" asked a female voice. "Briefly. Very defensive, typical military attitude. Kept talking about group housing and community standards like living on an army base was the same as luxury apartment living." The conversation continued, but I'd heard enough. Mrs. Whitmore was doing exactly what Jennifer and Brad had done at the leasing office, making assumptions based on limited information and using those assumptions to dismiss someone she'd decided didn't belong. I could have walked away. Could have gone upstairs, unpacked more boxes, started my new civilian life without getting involved in building politics or neighborhood drama. But something about the casual dismissal bothered me, especially coming from someone who'd introduced herself as part of the residents' council. Instead, I walked toward the seating area, my footsteps loud enough on the concrete pathway to announce my approach. "Good evening," I said as I reached their table. Mrs. Whitmore looked up, and I watched her expression shift through several emotions: surprise, embarrassment, calculation about how much I might have heard. "Miss Rodriguez," she said, her voice carefully controlled. "How are you settling in?" "Very well, thank you. Beautiful evening for outdoor conversation." The other 2 residents were looking between Mrs. Whitmore and me, clearly sensing undercurrents they didn't understand. The man was probably in his 50s, dressed in the kind of casual clothes that cost more than they looked like they should. The woman was younger, maybe early 30s, with the kind of precise makeup that suggested she'd never left the apartment without full preparation. "Sarah Rodriguez," I said, extending my hand to the man. "I just moved into 4C. "David Chen," he said, standing to shake my hand. "Welcome to the building." The name clicked immediately. "Any relation to Mr. Chen, who was in the leasing office yesterday?" "My father. He mentioned meeting you." David's handshake was firm, and something in his expression suggested he'd heard more about that meeting than just a casual mention. "Your father seems like a good man." "He is. 26 years Army. Taught me a lot about recognizing quality people." The comment was directed at me, but it was clearly meant for Mrs. Whitmore's benefit as well. A subtle reminder that his father's opinion carried weight, and his father had approved of me. "Linda Vasquez," the woman said, also standing to greet me. "I'm in 2B. Welcome to Burnside Commons." Her handshake was polite but brief, and I could see her evaluating me with the kind of attention people paid when trying to figure out how someone fit into their social ecosystem. "Thank you. Everyone's been very welcoming." It was a polite lie, but the kind of social courtesy that kept conversations moving in the right direction. "Patricia was just telling us about your background," David said, glancing at Mrs. Whitmore with an expression that suggested he wasn't entirely approving of what he'd heard. "Military service," Mrs. Whitmore said quickly, like she was trying to control the narrative. 22 years, I said, settling into the fourth chair around the table without being invited. "Career Army. What did you do in the Army?" Linda asked, genuine curiosity in her voice. "Intelligence analysis, strategic planning, operations coordination. Spent a lot of time overseas." David leaned forward, interested. "Dad mentioned you were an officer." "Major," I confirmed. "Major Rodriguez," he said, using my rank the same way his father had. "That's field grade. Significant responsibility." Mrs. Whitmore looked confused by the terminology, but I could see Linda processing the information with more understanding. "My brother's in the Air Force," Linda said. "Captain. He's always talking about wanting to make major." "It's a good rank," I said. "Enough authority to make decisions, not so much that you spend all your time in meetings." David laughed. "Dad always said the Army had the best sense of humor about its own bureaucracy." "Your father's right. We had to laugh about it or we'd go crazy." The conversation was flowing naturally now, the kind of getting-to-know-you chat that happened when neighbors met for the first time. But I could feel Mrs. Whitmore's tension. She'd expected to control this interaction, to set the tone and establish the social dynamics. Instead, she was watching me integrate into the group discussion without her permission or guidance. "So what brings you to Portland?" Linda asked. "Retirement? Transition to civilian life. I've got some consulting opportunities here, and the city seemed like a good fit." "What kind of consulting?" David asked. "Defense contracting." "Mostly. Strategy development, risk assessment, security planning. The kind of work that translates well from military experience." Mrs. Whitmore perked up at that. "Defense contracting. That sounds quite lucrative." Her tone had shifted. 20 minutes ago, she'd been dismissing me as rough around the edges and not invested in community standards. Now, hearing about consulting work and defense contracts, she was reassessing my financial prospects. "It can be," I said non-committally. "Are you working with any of the local firms? I might know some people in that industry." The eagerness in her voice would have been amusing if it wasn't so transparent. Mrs. Whitmore was the kind of person who measured social value in financial terms, and the possibility that I might be more financially successful than she'd assumed was changing her entire approach to the conversation. "I'm still exploring options," I said. "The transition from military to civilian work takes some navigation." "I'm sure someone with your background has plenty of opportunities," David said. "Dad's always talking about how the private sector undervalues military experience, especially at the officer level. Your father sounds like he had a good transition himself." "He did, eventually. Took him a while to find civilian work that felt meaningful after military service, but he ended up doing well in property management. Says it's not as different from military leadership as people think." Mrs. Whitmore was looking between David and me like she was trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. The dynamic had shifted in ways she hadn't anticipated, and she wasn't sure how to regain control of the situation. "Well," she said finally, "I should let you get back to your unpacking. Moving day is always exhausting. She stood up, clearly signaling that the social gathering was over, at least as far as she was concerned. Actually, Linda said, I was enjoying the conversation. It's nice to meet someone new in the building. David nodded agreement. Dad will want to hear how you're settling in. He doesn't meet many career officers anymore. Mrs. Whitmore's smile was strained. Of course, we should all get to know our new neighbors. Sarah, I hope you'll consider joining the Residence Council once you're settled. We always need fresh perspectives. The invitation was clearly motivated by her revised assessment of my potential value to the building's social hierarchy, but I appreciated the gesture regardless of its motivation. I'll keep that in mind, I said. Right now I'm focused on getting unpacked and established. Of course. Well, good night, everyone. She collected her wine glass and headed toward the building entrance, her small dog trotting alongside her. The rest of us watched her go in comfortable silence. She means well, Linda said once Mrs. Whitmore was out of earshot. She's protective of the building, David added diplomatically. I appreciated their loyalty to a neighbor, even one whose behavior they clearly found problematic. Every community has someone who takes ownership of maintaining standards, I said. It's not necessarily a bad thing, as long as the standards are fair. Dad said something similar after he met you yesterday. Said the best communities are the ones where people earn respect through their actions, not their assumptions. We talked for another 20 minutes, covering the kinds of topics that neighbors discuss: local restaurants, transportation options, building amenities, neighborhood safety. Normal civilian conversation that felt both familiar and foreign after decades of military social interactions. As we were preparing to head inside, Linda turned to me with a thoughtful expression. Can I ask you something, Major Rodriguez? Sure. When Patricia was talking earlier, before you joined us, she seemed to have some pretty strong opinions about military people in general. Do you run into that attitude often? It was a perceptive question, and I appreciated her directness. Sometimes, I said. People have different ideas about what military service means, and those ideas aren't always accurate. Some people assume military backgrounds mean one thing, others assume something completely different. What do you wish people understood? I thought about that for a moment. That we're just people doing a job. An important job, a challenging job, but still just a job. We're not all heroes, we're not all damaged, we're not all the same. We're individuals with different backgrounds and different experiences who happen to serve our country for a period of time. David nodded slowly. Dad says something similar, that the uniform doesn't make you a different species of human. Your father's a wise man. As we headed toward the elevator, I found myself thinking about the conversation I'd overheard earlier. Mrs. Whitmore's concerns about demographic shifts and building character weren't entirely unreasonable. Property values and community atmosphere were legitimate, concerns for long-term residents. But her assumptions about what those changes meant were based on stereotypes rather than reality. The elevator ride to the 4th floor was quiet, each of us lost in our own thoughts. David got off at 3, Linda at 2, leaving me alone for the final stretch to my floor. Back in apartment 4C, I made coffee and sat at my kitchen table, looking out the window at the Portland skyline. The city lights stretched out below me, a constellation of possibilities and challenges that represented my new civilian life. My phone buzzed with a text from my sister again. How was your first day in the new place? I stared at the message for a long moment, thinking about how to summarize the day's events. The moving crew, Mrs. Whitmore's assumptions, the evening conversation with my new neighbors, the gradual realization that civilian life was going to require different kinds of navigation than military life. Complex, I typed back, but promising. Good complex or bad complex? Jury's still out. She sent back a thumbs-up emoji, and I set the phone aside to finish my coffee. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. New assumptions to navigate. New ways to prove myself in a civilian world that didn't always understand what military service really meant. But tonight, sitting in my own apartment with my own furniture and my own view of the city, I felt something I hadn't expected: optimism. The transition from military to civilian life was going to be complicated, full of assumptions and misunderstandings and social dynamics I was still learning to navigate. But it was also going to be interesting. And after 22 years of military service, interesting was exactly what I needed. 3 weeks passed before I encountered Mrs. Whitmore again, and when I did, it wasn't under circumstances either of us could have predicted. The emergency started at 2:37 on a Tuesday morning, announced by the building's fire alarm system with the kind of electronic shriek designed to wake the dead and send everyone stumbling toward the nearest exit. I was awake before the alarm finished its first cycle. 22 years of military training had programmed certain responses so deeply into my nervous system that they functioned independently of conscious thought. Alert, assess, act. The sequence was automatic, playing out in the space between sleeping and fully conscious awareness. The smell hit me as soon as I opened my apartment door. Not smoke exactly, but something burning that shouldn't be burning. Electrical fire. My brain cataloged immediately, probably in the building's infrastructure rather than an individual unit. The acrid scent of melting plastic and overheated wiring that every soldier learned to recognize because it usually meant communication equipment was failing at exactly the wrong moment. The hallway was already filling with residents in various states of undress and confusion. Apartment doors were opening, releasing rectangles of light and bewildered voices asking questions nobody had answers to yet. The emergency lighting had kicked on, casting everything in harsh white illumination that made everyone look pale and disoriented. Mrs. Whitmore appeared from 4A wearing a silk robe and carrying her overdressed dog, both of them looking equally indignant at being disturbed. Her hair was in curlers, and without her usual makeup, she looked older and more vulnerable than the polished woman who'd lectured me about building standards. "What's happening?" she demanded, as if someone in the hallway should have been prepared to brief her on the situation. "Fire alarm," said Mr. Patterson from 4B, a statement so obvious it would have been funny under different circumstances. "I can hear the alarm, Robert. I want to know why it's going off." The smell was getting stronger, and I could see a faint haze beginning to form near the ceiling. Whatever was burning was getting worse, not better, and the building's ventilation system was starting to circulate the smoke throughout the structure. "We need to evacuate," I said, my voice cutting through the confused chatter, with the kind of authority that made people stop talking and pay attention. "Evacuate?" Mrs. Whitmore's voice went up half an octave. "It's probably just a false alarm. These systems are oversensitive." "The smoke is real," I said, pointing to the haze that was becoming more visible by the minute. "Electrical fire, probably in the basement or mechanical areas. We need to get everyone out of the building now." I was already moving toward the emergency stairwell, but I could see people hesitating, caught between the natural human tendency to minimize danger and the growing evidence that this wasn't a drill. "How do you know it's an electrical fire?" asked Linda Vasquez, who'd appeared from the stairwell with her hair in a messy ponytail and wearing pajamas that looked like they'd been grabbed in a hurry. "The smell, the color of the smoke, the way it's spreading through the ventilation system." I pushed open the stairwell door and immediately felt the difference in air quality. The stairwell was clearer, not yet contaminated by whatever was burning below us. "This is the safest exit route right now." Mrs. Whitmore was still standing in front of her apartment, clutching her dog, and looking like she was waiting for someone to tell her this wasn't really happening. "Patricia," I said, my voice firm but not unkind, "you need to come with us, now. I'm not leaving my apartment because of some mechanical malfunction." The smoke was getting thicker, and I could hear other residents beginning to cough. David Chen appeared from the third-floor stairwell, looking alert and focused in a way that reminded me of his father's military bearing. "Major Rodriguez," he called up to me, "building management is evacuating everyone to the parking lot. Emergency services are en route." The word "major" seemed to register with several residents who'd been hesitating. Military rank carried different weight in civilian situations, but in emergencies, people often looked for someone who seemed to know what they were doing. "Patricia," I said again, walking back toward her apartment, "I need you to come with me right now. Bring whatever identification and medications you need, but leave everything else. I'm not abandoning my home because you think you smell something burning." The stubbornness in her voice was familiar. I'd encountered it before in military situations. The psychological resistance that happened when people's brains refused to process danger that didn't fit their expectations. Combat veterans called it normalcy bias, the assumption that bad things happen to other people in other places, not to you in your safe, familiar environment. "Ma'am," I said, switching to the tone I'd used with civilian contractors in hostile environments, "this building is experiencing a significant fire emergency. The smoke is getting thicker, which means the situation is deteriorating rapidly. I need you to trust my assessment and evacuate immediately." Something in my voice must have penetrated her resistance, because she finally started moving toward the stairwell, her dog tucked under one arm and a small purse clutched in her free hand. The evacuation down 4 flights of stairs took longer than it should have, slowed by elderly residents who couldn't move quickly and confused people who kept stopping to ask questions nobody could answer yet. I ended up taking point, using my voice to keep people moving and organized, while David Chen brought up the rear to make sure nobody got left behind. By the time we reached the parking lot, the first fire truck was pulling into the complex, its red lights painting everything in pulsing crimson shadows. The firefighters moved with the kind of professional efficiency I recognized from my own experience with emergency response teams, quickly establishing a command post and beginning their assessment of the situation. The building's residents clustered in small groups on the asphalt, everyone talking at once and speculating about causes and consequences. Mrs. Whitmore had found a concrete planter to sit on, her dog in her lap, and her silk robe pulled tight against the cool night air. "Excuse me," called a voice from, she was tasting the word. "You mean like deployment?" "Multiple deployments. Iraq, Afghanistan, some other locations." The silence that followed was different from the earlier confusion. This was the quiet that happened when people realized they'd been operating with incomplete information about someone they thought they understood. "Combat?" Linda asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Some combat, yes." Captain Morrison returned to our group, interrupting what was becoming an increasingly personal conversation. "Building's clear for re-entry," he announced. "The fire's been extinguished and we've ventilated the smoke. You should be able to return to your units, but be aware that there may be lingering odors and some disruption to electrical service while repairs are completed." As the residents began dispersing back toward the building, Mrs. Whitmore lingered behind. "Major Rodriguez," she said, using my rank for the first time, "I wonder if I could speak with you privately for a moment." David and Linda took the hint and headed toward the building entrance, leaving Mrs. Whitmore and me alone in the parking lot with the flashing lights of the emergency vehicles. "I need to apologize," she said, "not just for tonight, but for how I've treated you since you moved in." "Mrs. Whitmore, that's not necessary." "Yes, it is." Her voice was firm, more decisive than I'd heard it before. "I made assumptions about you based on appearances, and those assumptions were wrong. Worse than wrong, they were unfair." I waited, sensing she had more to say. "When I saw you moving in with second-hand furniture and work clothes, I assumed you were someone who didn't belong in a building like this. Someone who might bring down property values or disrupt our community standards." The honesty was uncomfortable, but appreciated. "I've lived in military communities my entire adult life," I said. "I understand the concern about maintaining standards. It's not unreasonable, but my standards were based on the wrong criteria. Tonight showed me that character and competence don't necessarily look like what I expected them to look like." She paused, adjusting her grip on her dog, who had been remarkably patient throughout the entire emergency. "Can you tell me about your service?" she asked. "I mean, if you're comfortable talking about it." It was a fair request, and after what had happened tonight, it seemed like the right time for honesty. 22 years, like I mentioned. Started as an enlisted intelligence analyst, went to officer candidate school, worked my way up to major. Spent about half my career overseas, primarily in the Middle East, but some other regions as well. What did that involve? Intelligence gathering and analysis, mostly. Understanding threats, predicting enemy movements, coordinating with other agencies and foreign military units. Some direct action when necessary, but mostly strategic work. Direct action. Combat operations, when intelligence personnel had to accompany combat units, or when situations required immediate response. Mrs. Whitmore was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. "How many deployments?" "7 total. Some short-term, some extended." "And you were in charge of other soldiers?" "At various times, yes." "Intelligence units, joint task forces, coordination teams." "The responsibilities grew with the rank?" She shook her head slowly. "I had no idea. When you said government service, I thought you meant something like filing paperwork in an office building?" "Yes, exactly." She looked embarrassed. I'm realizing how naive that was. We started walking back toward the building, our footsteps echoing in the empty parking lot. The emergency vehicles were packing up their equipment, the crisis officially over, but leaving behind the kind of adrenaline residue that would keep most of us awake for the rest of the night. "Major Rodriguez," Mrs. Whitmore said as we reached the building entrance, "would you consider joining the Residence Council? I know I mentioned it before, but I'm asking for different reasons now." "What kind of reasons?" "We need someone with actual leadership experience, someone who knows how to handle crisis situations and make difficult decisions. Tonight proved that." I considered the offer. Civilian politics weren't something I'd had much exposure to, but community leadership was a skill set that translated across environments. "Let me get settled into civilian life a bit more," I said. "But yes, I'd be interested in contributing to the community." "Thank you." "And Major?" "Yes? Thank you for getting us all out safely tonight. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been there." The elevator ride to the 4th floor was quiet, both of us lost in our own thoughts about the night's events. When the doors opened, Mr. Patterson was waiting in the hallway, apparently having decided he needed to say something before returning to his apartment. "Major Rodriguez," he called out as we stepped off the elevator. "Yes, Mr. Patterson? I wanted to thank you for tonight. My wife has mobility issues, and I don't know how I would have gotten her down 4 flights of stairs quickly enough without your organization. I'm glad everyone made it out safely. Where did you learn to do that? Take charge like that?" I glanced at Mrs. Whitmore, who was listening to this conversation with obvious interest. "Emergency leadership was part of my military training. You learn to assess situations quickly and coordinate responses under pressure." "You were an officer?" "Major. 22 years of service." Mr. Patterson's eyebrows went up. "Major, that's significant rank. It was a good career. What kind of work did you do?" The same question everyone asked. The one that required explanations about security clearances and classified operations and responsibilities that didn't translate easily to civilian understanding. "Intelligence operations," I said, giving him the same brief answer I'd given the others. "Strategic planning, threat assessment, coordination with other agencies." "Overseas? Multiple deployments, yes." He nodded slowly, the kind of understanding that came from recognizing something significant, even if you didn't fully comprehend the details. "Well," he said finally, "I'm damn glad you live in this building." As we each headed toward our respective apartments, I reflected on how much had changed in the space of a few hours. The emergency had stripped away the social pretenses and assumptions that had defined my interactions with these neighbors, replacing them with something more honest and direct. Mrs. Whitmore had seen me take charge in a crisis and realized that her initial judgments had been based on incomplete information. Mr. Patterson had watched me coordinate an evacuation and understood that my background involved more responsibility than he'd assumed. David and Linda had witnessed the professional way I'd briefed the fire captain and recognized military training in action. Back in apartment 4C, I made coffee and sat at my kitchen table, looking out at the city lights and thinking about the strange trajectory of civilian life. In the military, your rank and responsibilities were visible to everyone around you. The uniform communicated your experience level, your authority, your place in the organizational hierarchy. Civilians knew where you stood and what you were capable of, because the visual cues were standardized and universal. But in civilian life, all of that information was invisible. People made judgments based on your clothes, your furniture, your apparent age, your perceived social class. The achievements that had defined my adult life were hidden beneath surface appearances that could be misleading or completely irrelevant to my actual capabilities. Tonight had been a reminder that crisis situations had a way of revealing truth. When people's safety was at stake, when quick decisions mattered, when leadership was needed, the surface judgments fell away, and what remained was competence and character. My phone buzzed with a text from David Chen. "Dad wants to know if you're okay after tonight. Says he's proud to have a neighbor with your background." I stared at the message for a moment, touched by the sentiment from someone I'd met only briefly. "Please tell him I'm fine," I typed back, "and thank him for the kind words." He also says if you ever want to talk about the transition from military to civilian life, he'd be happy to share his experience. I'd like that. "Coffee tomorrow?" There's a good place on Burnside. That sounds perfect. I set the phone aside and finished my coffee, thinking about how the night's events had changed my relationship with this building and these neighbors. Mrs. Whitmore's assumptions had been corrected by direct experience. Mr. Patterson had seen military leadership in action and understood what it meant. David Chen had witnessed the professional skills that came from decades of service and recognized their value. But more than that, the emergency had forced me to stop hiding behind vague references to government service and start being honest about who I really was and what I'd accomplished. The transition to civilian life didn't require abandoning my military identity, it just required finding ways to integrate it into a different kind of community. As I got ready for bed, I realized that tonight had been a turning point. Not just because of the fire, but because of what the fire had revealed about the importance of authentic relationships and honest communication. Mrs. Whitmore's apology had been genuine, born from the recognition that she'd misjudged someone whose skills had potentially saved lives. Tomorrow would bring new conversations, new opportunities to build relationships based on truth rather than assumptions. David Chen's invitation for coffee was a start, a chance to connect with someone who understood the challenges of military transition through his father's experience. The residence council position Mrs. Whitmore had offered was another opportunity, a way to contribute to the community while using leadership skills developed over decades of service. It wouldn't be the same as military command, but it would be a chance to serve in a different context. As I finally settled into bed, the smell of smoke still faint in the air from the evening's excitement, I felt something I hadn't experienced since arriving in Portland, a sense of belonging. Not because I'd changed to fit civilian expectations, but because circumstances had allowed me to show who I really was and have that person be valued and respected. The transition from Major Sarah Rodriguez to civilian Sarah Rodriguez was going to be complex, requiring navigation of new social dynamics and different kinds of relationships. But tonight had proved that the skills and character developed through military service had value in civilian contexts, and that authenticity was a better foundation for community than pretense. Tomorrow, I'd have coffee with David Chen and learn more about his father's experience with military transition. I'd continue settling into apartment 4C and building relationships with neighbors who now had a more complete understanding of who I was. I'd explore the consulting opportunities that were beginning to present themselves, finding ways to use military expertise in civilian contexts. But tonight, for the first time since leaving active duty, I felt like Major Sarah Rodriguez and civilian Sarah Rodriguez might actually be the same person after all. 6 months later, I was reviewing security protocols for a major defense contractor when my phone rang with a call from the building management office. Brad Morrison's voice carried an urgency I hadn't heard since the night of the fire evacuation. "Major Rodriguez, I hate to bother you, but we have a situation developing and I could really use your expertise." I saved my work and closed my laptop, already reaching for my keys. "What kind of situation?" "Potential security threat. Someone's been casing the building for the past 3 days, taking photos, asking questions about residents and access points. The police are involved, but they suggested I consult with someone who has security assessment experience." "I'll be right down." The elevator ride to the ground floor gave me time to shift from consulting mode to tactical assessment mode, the mental transition that had become second nature during my military career. When the doors opened, I could see through the lobby windows that there were 2 police patrol cars in the parking lot, and several residents clustered near the mailboxes, talking in the hushed tones people used when something serious was happening in their normally quiet neighborhood. Brad was waiting by the front desk with a Portland police detective, a woman in her 30s with the kind of alert expression that marked experienced law enforcement. She looked up as I approached, taking in my civilian clothes and professional demeanor with the quick assessment cops made of everyone they encountered. "Detective Martinez," she said, extending her hand. "You're Major Rodriguez?" "That's right. Mr. Morrison says you have relevant background for this type of situation. Military intelligence, strategic security assessment. 22 years of experience." Detective Martinez nodded approvingly. "We could use that perspective. Let me walk you through what we know." She pulled out her notebook and flipped to a page covered with precise handwriting. 3 days ago, residents started reporting a man in his 40s taking photographs of the building exterior, the parking garage entrance, and the courtyard area. Yesterday, he approached the mail carrier asking questions about delivery schedules and building access procedures. This morning, one of your neighbors caught him testing door handles on the ground floor. I listened carefully, automatically categorizing the information into threat patterns I'd learned to recognize overseas. What kind of questions was he asking the mail carrier? Delivery times. Whether packages get left in the lobbies of individual apartments. How often building management checks the mailroom. Whether there are security cameras covering the mailbox area. That's reconnaissance, I said immediately. He's mapping routine patterns and identifying vulnerabilities. Detective Martinez looked impressed. That's exactly what we were thinking. The question is reconnaissance for what purpose? Brad looked between the detective and me with obvious anxiety. Could this be someone planning a break-in? Or something worse? Hard to say without more information, I said. Detective Martinez, do you have a description of the individual? She consulted her notes again. White male, approximately 45. Average height and build. Wearing different clothes each day but always business casual. No vehicle observed, suggesting he's either parking off-site or using public transportation. Any interaction with specific residents? That's where it gets interesting. According to witnesses, he's shown particular interest in the 4th floor. Asked the mail carrier specifically about apartment 4C. My apartment. The tactical assessment shifted immediately from general building security to personal threat evaluation. A mental transition that brought back muscle memory from hostile environments where anonymous surveillance usually preceded targeted action. Detective, I said, my voice taking on the kind, controlled tone I'd used in military briefings. I think we need to consider this a directed threat rather than random criminal activity. Directed at you specifically? Possibly. Have there been any other unusual incidents in the neighborhood? Vehicles that don't belong? People asking questions about me specifically? Anyone inquiring about my background or current activities? Detective Martinez was taking notes rapidly. Not that we're aware of, but we'll expand our canvas. Mr. Morrison, has anyone contacted building management asking about Major Rodriguez? Brad shook his head, then stopped. Actually, wait. About 2 weeks ago, someone called asking about lease verification for Sarah Rodriguez. Said they were from a background check company. Did you provide any information? Standard policy is to confirm residency and rent payment status only. But the caller asked several follow-up questions about employment, length of residency, whether there had been any complaints or incidents. Detective Martinez and I exchanged glances. Background verification was normal for employment or security clearance investigations. But the timing and the current surveillance suggested something more concerning. Detective, I said, I think we need to consider the possibility that this is related to my military background or current consulting work. What kind of consulting? Defense contracting. Strategic security assessment for government agencies and private companies working on classified projects. The kind of work that might make someone interested in your personal security arrangements? Exactly. Mrs. Whitmore chose that moment to emerge from the elevator, probably returning from her afternoon shopping expedition. She took in the scene, her eyes moving from the police detective to Brad to me, and her expression shifted to immediate concern. What's happening? She asked, approaching our group with the kind of determined stride that suggested she wasn't going to be dismissed or redirected. Security situation, Detective Martinez said diplomatically. We're just gathering information. Mrs. Whitmore looked directly at me. This is related to your work, isn't it? It wasn't really a question. In the months since the fire evacuation, Mrs. Whitmore had become something of a protector of building security, taking personal interest in anything that might affect resident safety. She'd also developed a better understanding of what my military and consulting background actually meant in terms of potential risks and responsibilities. Possibly, I said. Someone's been conducting surveillance of the building, with particular interest in my apartment. The man with the camera, she said immediately. I saw him yesterday and the day before. He was being very systematic about it, taking photos from different angles, noting entry and exit points. Detective Martinez looked up from her notebook. You observed him directly? I watched the courtyard from my kitchen window. It's become a habit since the fire, keeping an eye on building activity. He was definitely conducting some kind of assessment. Did you see him interact with anyone? Mrs. Whitmore thought for a moment. He spoke briefly with Linda Vasquez when she was coming back from her morning run. And I saw him near the mailboxes when David Chen was checking his mail. I should probably talk to them, Detective Martinez said, making more notes. I can arrange that, Brad offered. Most residents should be home from work within the next hour. As we were discussing logistics, the front door opened and David Chen walked in carrying grocery bags and looking like he'd had a long day at work. He paused when he saw our group, immediately recognizing that something significant was happening. Everything okay? He asked, setting down his bags and approaching us. David, Mrs. Whitmore said, did you talk to that man who was taking pictures yesterday? The one near the mailboxes? David's expression shifted to alert attention. Yeah, actually. He asked me about building security, whether we had problems with package theft or unauthorized access. What did you tell him? Detective Martinez asked. Nothing specific. Just that it was a well-managed building with good security. But he kept pushing for details about access codes, whether residents felt safe, if we'd had any incidents recently. Did he ask about any residents specifically? David glanced at me before answering. He asked if I knew the woman in 4C, said he was considering renting in the building, and wanted to know about the types of tenants who lived here. The pattern was becoming clearer, and it wasn't random criminal activity. Someone was gathering intelligence about me specifically, using standard social engineering techniques to collect information from neighbors and building management. Detective Martinez, I said, I think we need to treat this as a potential directed threat. The surveillance pattern, the specific inquiries about my apartment, the questions about building security, all of it suggests someone is developing an operational plan. Operational plan for what? Unknown at this point, could be anything from simple harassment to more serious hostile action. Brad looked alarmed. Are we talking about danger to other residents? Unlikely, I said. If this is related to my work or background, the threat would be focused on me specifically. But we should take precautions for general building security regardless. Mrs. Whitmore had been listening to this exchange with growing concern, but also with the kind of focused attention that suggested she was processing information and formulating plans. Major Rodriguez, she said, what do you need from the Residents' Council to help address this situation? It was a practical question that recognized both the potential threat and my expertise in dealing with it. In the months since the fire evacuation, Mrs. Whitmore had become one of my strongest advocates on the Residents' Council, frequently deferring to my judgment on security and emergency preparedness issues. Increased situational awareness, I said. Residents should report any unfamiliar individuals asking questions about the building or specific tenants. Anyone conducting surveillance or showing unusual interest in access points, routine patterns, or security measures. I can send out a building-wide email, Brad said. Alert everyone to be aware of potential security concerns without causing panic. Good idea. Detective Martinez, what's the police department's assessment of the threat level? Given your background and the systematic nature of the surveillance, we're treating this as a credible security concern. We'll increase patrols in the area and investigate the individual once we identify him. I can provide some additional security recommendations for the building, I offered. Basic counter-surveillance measures, access control improvements, resident safety protocols. David had been quiet during this exchange, but now he stepped forward with a thoughtful expression. Major Rodriguez, my father would like to meet with you about this situation. He's got experience with security threats from his own military service, and he's been concerned about building safety since he heard about the surveillance. I'd appreciate his perspective. He's actually here right now, upstairs visiting. Would you like me to ask him to come down? Please. While David went to get his father, Detective Martinez finished taking statements from Mrs. Whitmore and Brad, collecting details about the surveillance activities and building security procedures. I found myself automatically shifting into threat assessment mode, analyzing sight lines, access points, and vulnerability patterns with the kind of systematic attention that had become second nature during overseas deployments. When David returned with his father, Mr. Chen's expression was serious and focused. He greeted Detective Martinez professionally, then turned to me with the kind of direct attention that suggested he understood the gravity of the situation. Major Rodriguez, he said, David's filled me in on the situation. This sounds like professional reconnaissance. That's my assessment as well. Given your background and current work, do you think this is related to foreign intelligence gathering or domestic criminal activity? It was a sophisticated question that demonstrated his understanding of the different types of threats that people in my position might face. Hard to determine without more information, I said. The techniques suggest professional training, but the motivation could be anything from industrial espionage to personal harassment. Mr. Chen nodded thoughtfully. During my transition from military service, I dealt with some similar situations. People who thought my background made me a target for various schemes, some legitimate concerns about operational security, some cases where former military personnel were specifically targeted for harassment or worse. How did you handle it? Combination of law enforcement cooperation, community awareness, and personal security measures. The key was not letting the threat disrupt normal life while still taking appropriate precautions. Detective Martinez had been listening to this conversation with obvious interest. Mr. Chen, you mentioned other cases involving former military personnel. Are you aware of any patterns or organizations that specifically target veterans or defense contractors? There are several possibilities, he said. Foreign intelligence services sometimes target former military personnel for recruitment or harassment. Domestic extremist groups occasionally focus on veterans they perceive as threats to their agenda. And there's always the possibility of criminal organizations looking for targets with valuable information or resources. The scope of potential threats was broader than I'd initially considered, but Mr. Chen's systematic approach to the problem was reassuring. This wasn't just about one suspicious individual. It was about developing a comprehensive response to ongoing security concerns. Detective Martinez, I said, what's the timeline for identifying the surveillance subject? We're reviewing security camera footage from neighboring businesses, canvassing the area for additional witnesses, and coordinating with federal agencies in case this has interstate or international implications. Federal agencies? Given your clearance level and current work, this could fall under federal jurisdiction if it's related to espionage or terrorism concerns. The conversation was interrupted by Brad's radio crackling with a message from building security. He listened briefly, then looked up at our group with obvious concern. Security guard just reported seeing the suspect again, this time in the parking garage. He's taking photos of vehicle license plates and examining the access control system. Detective Martinez was immediately alert. Is he still there? Security guard is maintaining visual contact but keeping his distance. Suspect doesn't appear to be aware he's been spotted. I need to coordinate with backup units, Detective Martinez said, pulling out her radio. While she called for additional police support, Mr. Chen moved closer to me with a serious expression. Major Rodriguez, until this situation is resolved, you should consider implementing personal security protocols. Varying your routine, maintaining situational awareness, coordinating with building security on your movements. I've been thinking the same thing. David and I would be happy to help with additional security measures. We've got experience with threat assessment and response. Mrs. Whitmore, who had been listening to this exchange, stepped forward with determination. Major Rodriguez, I want you to know that the entire Residence Council supports whatever security measures you think are necessary. This building is your home, and we're not going to let anyone make you feel unsafe here. The support was unexpected and touching. 6 months ago, Mrs. Whitmore had questioned whether I belonged in the building. Now she was ready to implement community-wide security measures to protect me from potential threats. Thank you, I said. That means more than you know. Detective Martinez returned from her radio conversation with updates. Additional units are en route. We're going to attempt to apprehend the suspect for questioning. Do you need anything from me? I asked. Stay available in case we need additional information about your background or current activities. And consider the security recommendations Mr. Chen mentioned. As law enforcement moved to address the immediate threat, I found myself reflecting on how much my relationship with this building and these neighbors had evolved. The emergency evacuation had established my credibility as someone who could handle crisis situations. The subsequent months had allowed deeper relationships to develop, based on mutual respect and understanding rather than initial assumptions. Now, facing a potential security threat, these same neighbors were rallying to support me, offering assistance and resources without question or hesitation. Mrs. Whitmore's transformation from skeptical gatekeeper to protective advocate was particularly remarkable. demonstrating how authentic relationships could overcome initial prejudices. The radio crackled again with an update from the parking garage. The suspect had been detained for questioning, found with detailed photographs of the building, resident vehicle information, and notes about security procedures. What had started as suspicious behavior was clearly revealed as systematic intelligence gathering. "Major Rodriguez," Detective Martinez said, "we're going to need a comprehensive briefing about your current work and any potential threat sources. Can you come to the station later today?" Of course. As the immediate crisis moved into investigation phase, the small group in the lobby began to disperse. Mr. Chen shook my hand with a firm grip of someone who understood the seriousness of what had just occurred. "Major Rodriguez, you handled this situation exactly right. Professional assessment, appropriate escalation, community coordination. Your neighbors are lucky to have someone with your experience looking out for building security." Mrs. Whitmore approached as Mr. Chen and David headed toward the elevator. "Major Rodriguez, I want to apologize again. Mrs. Whitmore, we've been through this. No, not for the assumptions I made when you moved in. For something else." She paused, seeming to gather her thoughts. "When I first met you, I thought the most important thing about a neighbor was whether they fit a certain image, whether they looked like they belonged in a place like this." She gestured toward the lobby, with its polished surfaces and upscale ambiance. "But tonight showed me what really matters in a neighbor. Someone who can assess threats and coordinate responses. Someone who puts community safety ahead of personal convenience. Someone who brings real expertise to bear on serious problems. Everyone contributed tonight. But you led. Just like you did during the fire evacuation. That's what real community leadership looks like. And it has nothing to do with designer clothes or expensive furniture." The elevator arrived, and we rode up to the 4th floor in comfortable silence. As we reached our respective apartment doors, Mrs. Whitmore turned back with one final comment. "Major Rodriguez, I've learned something important from knowing you. The most dangerous assumption you can make about someone is that you know everything you need to know based on first impressions." Inside apartment 4C, I sat at my kitchen table and looked out at the Portland skyline, thinking about the strange trajectory that had brought me to this moment. A potential security threat had revealed the depth of community support that had developed around me, support that was based on demonstrated competence and character rather than surface appearances. My phone buzzed with a text from my sister. "How's civilian life treating you?" I thought about the question seriously. 6 months ago, I would have said it was complicated, full of assumptions and misunderstandings that made every interaction feel like navigation through unknown territory. Tonight, surrounded by neighbors who understood my value and were willing to support me through crisis situations, the answer felt different. "Better than expected," I typed back. "Much better." The consulting work was thriving, built on the same skills and experience that had served me in the military. The community relationships were deeper and more authentic than I'd thought possible when I first walked into the leasing office wearing old jeans and carrying secondhand furniture. Most importantly, I'd learned that the transition from military to civilian life didn't require abandoning the identity and capabilities that had defined my career. It just required finding ways to apply them in different contexts, with different people, for different purposes. Mrs. Whitmore's evolution from skeptical gatekeeper to protective advocate was a microcosm of my own journey. Both of us had discovered that authentic relationships were built on truth rather than assumptions, on demonstrated character rather than surface appearances. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, including a comprehensive briefing with law enforcement about potential security threats. The investigation would continue, the threat assessment would be refined, and additional security measures would be implemented. But tonight, for the first time since leaving active duty, I felt completely at home in civilian life. Not because I'd changed to fit civilian expectations, but because I'd found a community that valued who I really was and what I could contribute. The apartment lease that Jennifer and Brad had initially questioned was now unshakable, secured not just by financial capability, but by demonstrated value to the community. The neighbors who had once made assumptions about my background now sought my expertise on security and emergency preparedness. Major Sarah Rodriguez and civilian Sarah Rodriguez had finally merged into a single person, equally comfortable leading evacuations and conducting threat assessments, equally valued for military experience and civilian contributions. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.